You are listening to Enjoy It While It Lasts. I'm your host, Herman Faust. Today I'm going to talk about Friday the 13th, the cultural significance of it, the fear of it, and where that started from. I'm basically going to try to answer the question, why do we care about Friday the 13th? Come chill with me and enjoy the talk. Paraskevidekatriophobia, the fear of Friday the 13th. It's estimated that between 17 and 21 million Americans are affected by this superstition. People will avoid making any important decisions on this day. They'll cancel flights or reschedule meetings, all to avoid the cursed Friday the 13th. So much so that economists have estimated up to $900 million in economic impact from loss of people traveling and shopping on these days. Of course, if there's something that some people fear, other people will celebrate it. Friday the 13th has become a very popular party day. It's become probably the most popular day to get a tattoo. And it's also spread into our culture through movies, through entertainment. But why? What's so bad about a Friday the 13th? How did this even become a thing? It starts with triskaidekaphobia, the fear of the number 13. Side note, this episode really has me facing my fear of saying hard words, otherwise known as hippomonstrosis quipadelphobia. But for now, we're talking about triskaidekaphobia, which is a pretty ancient fear that humans have had. A lot of people will attribute it to the story of the Last Supper, where Judas was the 13th guest. And we all know how that went, so it was considered unlucky to be the 13th of something. Modernly, apparently, we think that if we just call it the 14th, we are tricking the universe. Like when we skip the 13th floor in buildings, we act like, oh, there is no 13th floor, nothing to see here. I'm pretty sure that if there is this type of superstition and bad luck in the world, that it can see right past our poor counting skills. Christianity isn't the only religion that has a story connected to the number 13. Norse mythology also has its own story giving you warnings of the 13th guest. This is less widely known, so I'm going to actually tell this story for a minute. It actually starts with the god Balder, who was the son of Frigga. Frigga was the queen of the Norse gods, and Balder was her most beloved son and also just the most beloved god in general by other gods and by everyone on earth as well. Then Balder has 3 dreams that get progressively worse, ending with him dreaming of his own death. He tells his mother about it, and she, of course, is lamenting the fact that this can't be a prophecy. This must be just a dream. She starts crying, and in order to guarantee that this does not come to pass, she goes and gathers all the gods and all the creatures on earth, and she has them all promise not to hurt her son Balder, which they all do happily because they love him. Well, everyone loved him except for Loki. Loki hated Balder. He had never done anything wrong to him. He hated him because he knew that nobody would ever love him as much as they loved Balder. So he was just straight up jealous of all this love and adoration that this god is getting. Meanwhile, everyone thinks poorly of Loki. Being the trickster god that he is, Loki transformed himself into the form of an old woman and feigned ignorance when he went up to Frigga and was like asking, what all is this about? What is this celebration for? The queen of the gods told the old woman, aka Loki, that she had gotten the promise from every god and every being, every plant even, to not harm her son. She said that she only didn't get the promises from the most insignificant of plants. There was this mistletoe, which she found harmless, so she didn't bother. With this information, Loki gathered some mistletoe without being seen, and he carved it down, whittled it into a dart. He then went to another god, Hod, associated with winter and darkness. Hod was blind, and Loki, again, as disguised as an old woman, went to Hod and said how happy, how joyful everyone is, and how they're all celebrating in these games, participating in these games to celebrate his brother that everyone loves, but asks why Hod won't celebrate and play in a game as well. He touched his eyes and declared that he's blind so that he wouldn't be able to see. So he had no way to aim whatever weapon he would throw as the other gods were doing in celebration. The old lady said that she could help him out, that he would throw it and she would, standing next to his side, guide his elbow to make sure that the throw was cast in a safe direction. This, of course, led to Hod throwing the mistletoe dart directly into Balder's heart, killing the god that everyone loved. At first, the other gods were appalled at what Hod had done, and then he claimed that it was the old woman that guided his arm. And when they could find the old woman, when they could not find the old woman, she had disappeared, they realized that it was Loki that was behind this. The gods tried and failed to bring Balder back to life, and that's an interesting story in and of itself. But eventually had to give up on the idea, and they had a dinner in remembrance of the god that they all loved. The 12 gods gathered and were sitting peacefully at the table when Loki arrived as the 13th uninvited guest. He ended up killing a servant and then just kept on berating the gods for their weakness and their imperfections. And even though the gods were forbidden from violence when they were all gathered, his voice kept getting louder and louder to the point where Thor couldn't take it anymore. And this led to the gods binding Loki into shackles and putting him into his underground eternal prison. Now, while both of these stories are popular and help spread the fear of the number 13, neither are responsible for the origination of the fear. In fact, the fear existing and being present ever since ancient numerology probably led to Judas being the 13th guest in Christian mythology. As far back as potentially 3000 BCE, the number 12 has always been looked at as a representation of completeness, of wholeness, of divinity. That's why we have 12 months in the calendar. There are 12 moon cycles. There's 12 zodiac signs. So then with that, 13 was looked at as the disruptor, the breaking of perfection. So humans have always had an issue with the number 13. It's always put us on edge. Fridays have also had its own stigmatization, independent of Friday the 13th. And a lot of that also stems from Christianity, with the fact that Jesus was crucified on a Friday. It also is the day that marks the fall of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Throughout time, sailors have tried to avoid starting their journeys on a Friday, believing that if you start your journey on a Friday, you're inviting heavy storms and bad luck on the trip. And this type of superstition also went all the way back in medieval times for anyone going on journeys. It was always looked at as if you leave on a Friday, you're inviting disaster. So naturally, you combine a bad luck day with a bad luck number, and you're double bad luck. Now I want to look at the first major historical event that is associated with Friday the 13th. We're going to talk about the Knights of Templar. After the First Crusades, French knights formed the order to protect pilgrims from bandits and hostile forces. The Order of Knights was granted headquarters in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is where they get their name from. This was a new type of knighthood. These were monk knights. So they were religious monks sworn to poverty, sworn to chastity, and obedience to the church, but they were also trained killers and were looked at as elite shock troops in the crusade. These are the ones that were recognized by their white mantles with a red cross. I think that's the image that most people will think of when they think of a knight of during the Crusades. So, as the order grew, because they were so trusted and had such safe facilities, they also became an early banking system, and it allowed travelers to deposit money in Europe and withdraw money in the Holy Land. They became immensely wealthy, and they had a lot of land across Europe, across the Middle East, including different churches and farms, and even the island of Cyprus. Now, when the Crusader states fell, the Templars lost their primary purpose and they relocated their headquarters to Paris, but they still had this massive fortune. During this time, King Philip IV of France was heavily in debt, including owing a lot of that debt to the Knights of the Templars. He started making accusations against the Knights to turn public opinion against them. He accused that they were denying Christ and committing blasphemy by having false idols that they worshiped. And he claimed that part of their initiation routines were these obscene kisses, where a incoming knight would have to kiss a current presiding knight along the base of the spine and the navel. And he even suggested that they had institutional policies promoting sodomy inside the Knights of Templar. In response to these allegations, Pope Clement V, who was also kind of looked at as a puppet pope, his headquarters was also within range, in France, within range of the king, and the previous pope had been kidnapped by the king before, but Pope Clement investigated the knights, and there was actually internal papers that have been found that show that his investigation, the church's investigation into the knights, found that they were absolved of all charges of heresy and found the knights guilty of only minor immorality charges. They were planning to reform instead of destroy the knights. However, the king persisted and he issued arrest on all knights of the Templar on Friday the 13th in October of the year 1307. The Pope publicly backed the king and said that he found the allegations to be true. The knights were then subjugated to torture. They would tie their hands behind their backs and pull them up by their wrist that were bound together, and then drop them, making the shoulders dislocate. They subjugated them to fire torture, roasting victims, greasing their soles of their feet with lard and oil and holding them over open flames. They put them on the rack, which is one of the more famous devices that was used back in those times, where they would stretch people's bodies until their limbs were dislocated and ligaments were snapped. And they also used extreme isolation and deprivation, including starving and sleep depriving and just keeping them in pits or very tight spaces for years at a time. And they did this to force confessions. Basically, they're going to keep torturing you until you confess, and then we can just let you die in peace. The Grand Master of the Knights, Jacques de Molay, is one of the knights that did confess under torture. But whenever he was being executed by being burned at the stake. And as he was being burned, he renounced his confession, and he summoned the king and the pope to meet him before the tribunal of God within a year. A lot of people said that this put a curse on them, and whether it was a curse or coincidence, Pope Clement V died just 1 month later of illness, and King Philip IV died 7 months later when he was on a hunt and had a stroke which caused him to fall off of his horse. He died a few weeks later due to his brain injuries. Another man-made tragedy that happened on a Friday the 13th was the terrorist attacks that happened in Paris on November the 13th in 2015, which led to the deaths of 132. There's also been natural disaster that's hit on a Friday the 13th. The deadliest tropical cyclone on record happened in 1970 when the Bola cyclone caused 300 to 500 deaths in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. It was a Category 4 cyclone with winds over 125 miles per hour and a storm surge of up to 33 feet. This wiped out entire villages, destroyed homes, crops, boats, and just caused widespread flooding. Another famous incident that happened on Friday the 13th is the crash of the Uruguayan Air Force flight that was carrying the rugby team to Chile. The co-pilot miscalculated their position, and he initiated a descent too early while they were still over high peaks in the Andes Mountains. The aircraft ended up hitting one of those peaks, and it sheared off the wings, one of the wings, and the tail. The initial crash killed many people, and several more died due to their injuries or the cold. And there was also a avalanche in the following days that killed a few of the survivors of the crash. Out of the 45 people that was on the flight, 16 survived to be rescued. The flight crashed on October 13th, and the rescue did not happen until December 20th. In order to be survivors, they did end up having to turn to cannibalism, eating the frozen bodies of the other victims. The group was able to hear on a radio that the search was being called off, that they were all being declared dead. At this point, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, they went on a 10-day trek and traveled over 38 miles through the mountains to be able to reach somebody that could then get word and then initiate the actual rescue of the rest of the survivors. Not everything that's happened on a Friday the 13th is bad, though. This is also the day where dinosaur eggs were first discovered. I guess I shouldn't say that's good just yet, and this might end up being a bad thing if we do keep cloning animals and we end up bringing about a real life Jurassic World. Never mind, this might be a bad sign. Also, Super Mario was released back in September, Friday the 13th in 1985. You can either take that as a positive or you can look at that as ominous and say that games really are the downfall of our society. The same could be said for heavy metal, as Black Sabbath released its first album on a Friday the 13th. I mentioned briefly about the impact that Friday the 13th has had culturally in regards to tattoos. It is the busiest tattoo day of the year by far. In fact, most tattoo shops will not schedule any appointments on the day. They will only have walk-ins, and they a lot of times will only be doing Friday the 13th tattoos, which are typically looked at as they have a preset list of tattoos you can choose from on the day, usually being smaller, and you can only get it on certain places of your body. They're not going to do very elaborate tattoos on a Friday the 13th because it's all about volume that day. They're trying to get you in and get you out and get the next one in the chair. And it, again, works because every shop is packed every Friday the 13th. And luckily for them, for tattoo shops, there is a Friday the 13th every year. There's at least one. This year, in 2026, there's actually 3, and that's the most you can have in a year. Friday is actually the most common day for a 13th to fall on. We know this because our calendar repeats itself every 400 years. And in one 400-year cycle, a 13th of a month falls on a Friday 688 times. It falls on a Sunday or a Wednesday 687, Monday or Tuesday 685, a Thursday or a Saturday 684. So out of 400 years, there is one more Friday the 13th than there is Sunday the 13th. But no matter how many more, it still is the most likely day for the 13th to be on. Despite there always being this natural fear of the number 13 and the day of Friday, and despite the events of the Knights of Templar being pointed to as the origin of Friday the 13th being looked at as bad luck, a lot of historians believe that the myth of Friday the 13th didn't actually start taking place, or taking hold at least, until later in the 1800s. There are some folk researchers that have found writings from the year 1834 in France that mention Friday the 13th as unlucky. The first documented mention in English occurs in Henry Sutherland Edwards' biography of Gioacchino Rossini, and it was noted that Gioacchino Rossini, he feared all Fridays already, and he feared the number 13. So it was very notable when he died on a Friday the 13th. The day entered mainstream culture a little bit more in 1907 with the publishing of the book Friday the 13th, which was about a stockbroker who used the fear of the day to trigger panic in the market, and also set up the idea that Friday the 13th is bad for you to make any financial moves. The book was popular enough to have a movie created for it as well. In the 1970s, we started having a trend of news organizations featuring more weird news stories, more story of the weird on Friday the 13th, which led to it being more top of mind of being just an odd day. They kind of played into the trend and leaned into violent stories on that day as well. We've also seen different claims that emergency rooms are more packed on Friday the 13th. And this has been studied slightly. It's not been extensively studied, but in the studies, a lot of the times it is self-fulfilling prophecies, because there are people that are either out drinking more because it's a Friday the 13th, out partying more, and leading to more accidents. There's also the psychological aspect where you are expecting something crazy to happen, so you add to the importance of whatever does happen. Then, of course, the film series Friday the 13th is probably what has contributed the most to the idea of Friday the 13th being front of mind for everybody. It's one of the bases of slasher films and 80s horror movies. So this definitely took it up a notch and has probably contributed the most to Friday the 13th being the cultural phenomenon that it is today. People are pattern seeking. We try to seek patterns to predict danger and help us stay safe and get ahead in life. But as part of that, sometimes we don't realize when we are just simply confirming whatever biases we already had. So when we see something bad happen historically on a Friday the 13th, we automatically jump to, oh, see, I knew that day was bad luck, instead of, well, bad things happen on all dates. This happens especially when it's some culturally reinforced over and over. The Friday the 13th is off, is bad luck, is something to be wary of. So where even if you don't really believe it, it at least lays the groundwork for the bias in your head, so that when something happens weird to you, it confirms it to you. Now, unlike some things where our biases being confirmed really mess us up and lead towards us damaging society, this is one where we actually all just kind of get to have fun together and be spooked out a little bit, or go get a tattoo and have an extra drink. Whatever you're going to do today for your Friday the 13th, remember, you only got one life to live. You might as well enjoy it while it lasts.